I actually initially was sort of scared of acting. I'm pretty much an introvert. I like to sort of be by myself. And so my family was heavily involved in the opera in Chicago where I grew up. And as a little kid, they thought it would be cute if I would be an extra in the opera, what's called a supernumerary. And I was way too shy. I wasn't interested in that at all. But somehow, when I was in middle school, like 6th grade, they took me backstage at the Opera House. And backstage at an opera house is huge. It's like a city back there. And so I would watch these people come off the street, people who were going to be in the opera, and they would get on this elevator and go up to whatever floor, put on their makeup, come back down, and they looked like Henry VIII. They looked astounding. And so I sort of fell in love with making that illusion for the audience. I thought that was very compelling. So that was sort of my way into acting, was, oh, it's cool to tell stories, and the audience likes it. It's enjoyable to see their reactions to it. And so that was sort of my focus when it came to acting. It was about storytelling and creating stories for the audience.
What was it like being, I guess, becoming Winston for, being the voice actor of Winston?
Well, acting for Winston was interesting because Overwatch, when we were first working on the project, it was so under wraps. I didn't even know what the name of it was. It was actually working under a code name. I knew my character's name was Winston, and I knew he was a gorilla, but I really didn't know much more than that as we started. And I'm honestly not sure how much the creators knew. I think they were also starting to figure out the world and figure out how things work. So I was brought in pretty early in the process. And so there was a sort of interesting back and forth that happened when I finally saw the first cinematic trailer for Overwatch. And I really got to see Winston sort of in motion. I mean, we'd obviously had to record the lines for him and done all the fighting noises and whatnot. But when I finally saw the whole trailer together, that really cemented the world of Overwatch for me. And so when I saw that, I went, oh, I sort of get it now. I have a much clearer idea of where we're headed. And I think that's been a process throughout a lot of this. I mean, from what I understand, the notion of a character like Doomfist was sort of just an idea in that trailer, and then later they're like, maybe we should make Doomfist a playable character, And so that's an interesting thing about the process with Overwatch, is that it is iterative. That as they move forward, they're polishing and they're focusing and they're trying to craft it better. So for me, it was a lot about trying to find Winston's heart and what motivated him. That really cemented when I saw the trailer.
Has your approach to voicing Winston changed at all since the release of the game?
I don't necessarily think it has. I think once I slotted into Winston and figured out what really made him tick, I don't think his motivation has changed much. Winston is a pretty consistent guy, as opposed to somebody like Soldier 76, who started in a place of more optimism and became very disillusioned with the world as time went on. Soldier 76 has a bit of an axe to grind. He's had a longer emotional journey than Winston. Winston has had his emotional stuff too. It's just that from the beginning of the game to where we are now, it hasn't changed that much. Most of his emotional journey happened back when he was on Horizon Lunar Colony. I come and I try to do my best. I mean, sometimes what'll happen is we'll have lines that are funny joke lines or lines that reference stuff, and so I try to imagine how Winston would quote Carl Sagan, because that's sort of fun. So that might adjust things. But Winston, I think I've got a pretty good handle on him right now.
Any questions? Let's go right here.
All right. As a voice actor, how do you get into character or approach that? You seem to have like a really good grasp of Winston, but if we give you a character, what's your first steps?
So I've been trying to actually think about this and break this down, because my students ask me about this all the time. I run a podcast called Voice Acting Mastery, and I teach classes both in Los Angeles and online. And often my students are trying to figure this out because I talk about it in terms of getting into the psychology of the character. Can you understand where the character is coming from? And they're like, well, that's cute. Do I take a psychology class? Like, how do I do that? And so I think what I've been starting to boil it down to is, what is the character fascinated with or obsessed with? And what is the character's damage? Like, what hurt the character? And I find that if I can find those two poles, like what are they fascinated with and what have they been hurt by, that usually gives me a really good insight into the character. Often those two are related, right? Often the damage can influence the fascination and vice versa. But when I get a sense of that, then I feel like I have a much better idea of how the character looks at the world, how they view the world, how they approach the world, what their cosmology is, what their belief systems are. I guess you could describe it as the character's agenda, because that tends to be consistent regardless of individual scenes. A character in this scene might want something, in another scene might want something else, but the overall agenda of that character, the sort of what that character cares about in the larger scheme of things, tends to be pretty consistent.
What was it like watching the death and resurrection of Young Justice?
Well, I'm not sure I watched the death and resurrection of Young Justice that much. I don't do much social media. I find social media actually to be very corrosive to people's psyche and to our society at large, so I'm not actually a fan of social media. And I know that much of the campaign or the rallying cry for Young Justice was done on social media. And so that's wonderful. I'm glad that people were able to contact the influencers and the producers and whatnot to convince them that there was a market for Young Justice so that it could continue. I mean, I think that's a good thing. But I was not on the sidelines for that. I wasn't really watching that happen. Somebody, I think, tweeted at me that, I hear Young Justice is coming back. And I'm like, great, that's wonderful. I think it's an absolutely fabulous show, and certainly would love to come back and play in that world more. But that's all I know. Most of my communication is from the producers themselves, if and when they're going to call us back to work on it. So, because people will say stuff online all the time. Oh, such and such a show is getting done. That's nice. Until I hear the producers call me, I don't trust that anything's happening.
What can you tell me about smuggling art during the Iron Curtain?
So I often mention that my family used to smuggle artwork out of Czechoslovakia during the Soviet occupation. And what that means is that my father, during the Prague Spring 1968, the Dubček years, actually made friends with a bunch of painters and sculptors in Prague who were abstract expressionists. And one of them was actually here in the US visiting my family when the Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to shut down this sort of liberalization of the city and to clamp down. And when they did, when the Soviets clamped down, they stopped supporting abstract art. They would only support socialist realism. So most of my father's friends were basically out of a job. They couldn't make any money. And so my family would sort of set up a distribution system for them, where we would come over and we would bring them acrylic paint so they could keep working. And we would pay for their artwork in American dollars, which is hard currency, which is valuable outside of Czechoslovakia because the Czech crown at that time was a communist currency. It wasn't worth anything outside of Czechoslovakia. So we would buy their artwork for hard currency and smuggle it back to the US to sell it on their behalf. So we were basically their distribution wing. We were trying to support the good guys who were making art. And it was gorgeous art. I mean, it was beautiful, and it wasn't even political. It was all abstract, beautiful art. Actually, one of them was. Janošek, one of the sculptors, did make a flame that he put in Wenceslas Square, which was about the man who immolated himself in protest against the Soviets. So yes, as a child, I was sort of doing that. We would do it as a family trip. So on regular intervals, every couple of years, we would go over to Prague and buy a whole bunch of artwork from our friends and pay them for it and then bring it back to America and sell it. Which is ironic because my dad would then sell it to a bunch of his friends, but then he admired the artwork so much he would go back later and buy it all back from his friends because he liked it so much. But it was an incredibly valuable experience for me as a child because I spent time as a child behind the Iron Curtain. And until you've had personal experience of a totalitarian state, who knows, we might be getting close to it here in America. We seem to be getting closer every day. But I think the reason we're getting closer is because people don't know. People don't know what it was like to be behind the Iron Curtain. People don't know what it means when a government doesn't tell the truth, when they obscure facts, when truth becomes relative. That's what it was like behind the Iron Curtain. And I remember turning to my mom when I was 12 years old and asking her, how come none of the grown-ups smile? And she was like, excuse me? I said, well, our friends when they're with us smile, and I see children smiling, but I never see any grown-ups on the street smiling. How come none of the grown-ups smile? And she had to explain to me World War II, Soviet occupation, Stalinist Russia, all this stuff. And it was a wake-up call every time I flew from America to Prague and back, because our friends were in danger. You know, they probably weren't going to mess with us. We were an American family. We had artwork. They probably weren't going to detain us, but they could hurt our friends. You know, we could have dinner with somebody and the next day find out they were thrown in jail and they might disappear and we don't know what's going to happen to them. And having firsthand experience of that kind of government, I think, will make someone incredibly adamant about not allowing that to happen again. That should never be allowed. That alternative facts are unacceptable. This is not just, oh, that's cute. No, this is dangerous. People will die. You know, that's what can happen if you let that train out of the station. You cannot allow that to happen. And even as a kid, I sort of wished that many of my classmates could just have that experience, to know that your room is bugged, to know that as a child, anything I say probably won't hurt me because it would be an international incident if they hurt an American in Prague, but could definitely hurt my friends, and I have to be aware of that. And Big Brother is watching you, you know, and that is a horrible Orwellian thing that we should avoid at all costs.
Any other questions?
On a much lighter note,
Yes.
how did you approach voicing established characters like those in the DC universe?
I think, well, that's a good question. I think when I'm approaching established characters in the DC universe, I don't listen to other actors. What I try to do is I try to understand the core of the character, the psychology, right? What are they fascinated by, and what is their damage? Because that was certainly the case when many years ago when I worked on a game called Justice League Heroes, and I played Superman. And I had been called back on that game for the character of Martian Manhunter, which I really wasn't right for. But the director, in her infinite wisdom, said, yeah, I don't think you're right for Martian Manhunter, but why don't you read for Superman? I'd like to hear your Superman. Now, I would imagine that many people, if they were called on to play Superman, would have all sorts of different former actors in their head, whether it's Christopher Reeve or Nolan, who plays Superman on Young Justice, or whoever who has played Superman, that they have to live up to that notion. Well, I didn't have that, because that's not as big a concern to me. Because my focus is on storytelling, I look at Superman and I have to decide, well, what do I think is compelling about Superman? What do I like about Superman? And how would I play him if given the chance? And to me, Superman is a character who has no subtext. He means what he says and says what he means all the time. There's no subterfuge whatsoever. There isn't a dissembling bone in his alien body. And so what does it mean to play someone with that level of sincerity? And so when they asked me to read for Superman, I said, okay. Now, I didn't tell them that was my interpretation of the character. That was something happening in my head. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to play super sincere alien guy. And then I read the lines, and that's what comes out. And they said, yep, you're Superman. So for me, that's the key to playing any of these characters, is not being slavishly tied to some sort of tradition in terms of performance tradition, but instead being invested in the meaning of the character and what motivates the character. And that motivation and that meaning may change over time. You know, the way that Batman was done with Adam West on TV is very different from the way we sort of look at Batman now, and is even different from the way Frank Miller did Batman in Dark Knight Returns. So you have to be true to that notion of the character. Same thing with somebody like Bugs Bunny. Bugs Bunny would change as a character no matter who was directing him, whether it was Tex Avery or Friz Freleng or Chuck Jones. You know, Bugs would shift slightly. So you got to be true to that character. And that's usually what I'm aiming for, is I'll try to use my knowledge of the history of the character to say, okay, what do I think the character is about right now? And that's what I try to give them.
I think I'm gonna take one more. Let's go.
So I know some of the Overwatch voice actors, like Sombra's voice actor, do like skits with the characters, and I've seen you've done a couple. What's it like being sort of part of that family? Since I don't think I've seen any other community of voice actors come together to do skits and do videos together. Like, have you enjoyed doing that?
Yeah, I've absolutely enjoyed it. Anjali Bhimani, who plays Symmetra, has sort of become our den mother. And she sort of wrangles us all together. And I think that it is a testament to the optimism and the idealism of the world of Overwatch that you have that sort of sensibility. Everyone is so excited to work on something that is so aspirational. And so it's that enthusiasm sort of bubbles over. Like we can't help but be excited about this world and our characters. And because everyone's so invested in their characters, and because everyone is so well cast. I mean, everyone who's playing their characters in Overwatch, there's something really essential close to their heart that resonates with the character they're playing. And so it's very personal, our relationship with each one of our characters. And I think for a lot of the actors, many of them aren't voice actors primarily, right? They may have started in film or TV, and the voice acting world is new to them. So in a way, they're looking for sort of a little bit of community with their fellow voice actors going, how does this work exactly? And so it's been enjoyable. I hope there are many more shows, games, that are as aspirational and inspirational as Overwatch.
All right. Well, that's all the time for questions we have. Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you.